Welcome to a Prevent Connect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
Hello everyone, this is Ashley Klein from Prevent Connect, and today I'm talking with Laura Zam. Laura is a writer, performer, speaker, and educator who uses theater to address a multitude of issues, including sexual violence prevention and trauma recovery. Hi Laura, thanks so much for being with us today. How are you?
I'm great. So fantastic to be here with you, Ashley. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, thank you for taking time out of your day to chat with me about the work that you're doing. I'd love to get started by just hearing a little bit about how you got started using theater in your work.
Sure. So I spent about a couple of decades as a writer and a performer. I was educated originally as an actor, and I started writing for myself, creating storytelling performances back in the early 90s. And then in the late 90s, I got an opportunity to work with youth who were living in conflict zones, including teens from the Middle East, Jewish Israeli teens and teens from all over the Arab world. And I was using theater, different kinds of dialogue techniques with them and storytelling in order to get them to understand each other enough to sit down and to become leaders in the peace movement that they could then carry into their lives and even take into the communities and create more stability and even peace in the Middle East, which is a huge task. It was one small part of this, but the organization is still going, doing this kind of work, which was really incredible. So it was the first time that I had adapted my skills to working on social change, working on social issues. Subsequent to that, I had the opportunity to work with trauma survivors, different kinds of trauma survivors, including a program I did at the DC Rape Crisis Center using writing and performing as healing modalities, and also giving survivors a chance to tell their story and tell a lot of different kinds of stories for the purposes of their healing.
Wonderful. Thank you. I mean, that sounds like a lot of really important work that you did, and I think that art and theater in general has a way of speaking across many different boundaries.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Well, I know that you recently piloted a sexual violence prevention program at Indiana University. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit about what that was like and what that work looked like.
Sure. So the program that I piloted was at Indiana University South Bend. They have different campuses. This was the South Bend campus. And I did a variety of things when I was on campus there. One thing that I did was this sexual prevention workshop, which I'll talk about, but there was another piece to what I did. The program that I did is called Dialogue Theater, and this is my terminology for a kind of theater that was actually developed by a fellow named Augusto Boal, who was a Brazilian theater maker and social activist. And he developed these techniques over the course of many years and decades, working with non-actors, teaching them improvisational skills that were really like dramatic facilitation skills. So he would create these real kinds of situations and have participants come up and enact different situations from their lives. And he would use this as an opportunity to have them talk about solutions to different social problems. So I adapted this and called it dialogue theater because it's known as forum theater, which may not be known outside of the theater world. So I called it dialogue theater because I had the same intention to bring this kind of work to consent education and also bystander intervention education to basically get the participants involved in creating solutions that would be based on realistic situations or real life situations. And the program I did at IUSB, Indiana University South Bend, was actually working with peer educators so that they could then take these techniques and they could then present them to different kinds of students. And also they use these techniques, which are basic, fundamentally improvisational techniques, to create skits for freshman orientation.
Wonderful.
But
So I have a question. You said that you were working with peer educators.
right.
Did they have a background in theater or at least an interest? Or how did that kind of translate to the work that they're doing?
That's such a great question. They had, to my knowledge, none of them had a background in theater whatsoever. So the techniques, the way that I present them, is very much informed by work that I've done working K through 12. Sometimes I do arts integration and adapt that to anti-bullying. And when I'm working in the schools, my training is to break things down to a very, very, very basic and non-scary level. So I'm accustomed to working with non-actors. So yes, they were non-actors, but I break down the improvisation techniques and the dialogue theater techniques so that there's nothing really overly theatrical about it.
Okay.
You don't have to have any knowledge in this kind of discipline in order to thrive doing these improvisations. The stakes are quite low from an aesthetic standpoint. There's no expectation that you're going to become a fabulous performer. Instead, the focus is really on how can I help you using these techniques to act out real life situations, and then let's practice. Let's talk about how we can implement different kinds of bystander education, consent education that you may have already learned. How can we enact those so that we can look to see what's effective, what's not effective, and most importantly, where might there be obstacles to implementing any of these? And let's see if we can work out those kinks together.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to go back to dialogue theater for just
Sure.
a minute, and you kind of explained what that was. But why do you think that dialogue theater has the ability maybe to have folks have conversations about topics that, socially are not the most comfortable things to discuss? What is it about dialogue theater that you think kind of speaks to that and lets folks process those issues?
Yeah, I think that one thing that it does is it allows them to take control of the training, so to speak, because the scenarios are their scenarios, not my top-down scenarios. I'm not asking them to adopt anything that is not jiving with what's going on in their own lives. So I think that there's such an opportunity for much more buy-in because there's much more, well, there's 100%, I'm basing this 100% on their lives. I'm not making assumptions about their lives. And consequently, they're really involved in using situation or enacting situations, but also solving things on their own terms. Again, I think that there's much greater buy-in that way. I also think that in using theater in this way, there's an element of fun, which can be missing from this kind of work, as you know. And maybe it's controversial, I don't know, to say that these trainings need to be fun, but from a pedagogical standpoint, from a neuroscience standpoint, for anything to take hold, any kind of education to take hold, there has to be some sort of pleasure involved. I mean, part of the research is showing that adopting any of these techniques is going to be dependent on to what degree the participants can answer the question, what's in it for me, right? That they can answer that in a way that is satisfying to them. So part of the appeal, I believe, with this technique is that we do get to answer that question in terms of, right, what's in it for me, because we can explore that on the spot through these techniques, but also the technique itself, the process of learning about it becomes fun, has appeal in and of itself, which I think is very helpful in this regard.
Yeah. Well, and I think sadly, in some ways, when we talk about bystander intervention, we are asking people to, do something that they might not be accustomed to and kind of stretch a little bit. And so getting that buy-in, like you said, is really important in order for folks to build skills. So.
Exactly. And so, right, because when we can play out this different situations, we see on the spot where there are where there's awkwardness, where there's trepidation, where something's just not feasible as it's been presented to them. So we can play that out, and then we can try and maneuver around those obstacles, and they have an opportunity, as you're suggesting, they have the opportunity to practice these things that may not be comfortable for them, and maybe also to find a better solution than what they thought was actually the solution.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for going through that and sharing that. So we've been doing a lot of work with prevention on college campuses, and one of the conversations that we've had is just the importance of prevention efforts really being comprehensive. And so this idea that there's not one program that will end sexual violence on a campus, but rather that we need multiple strategies, from multiple disciplines, and we need them to work across the socio-ecological model. So I'm wondering how you see theater as part of a comprehensive prevention plan to prevent sexual violence on campus. Where does theater fit in? What are the potentials?
There's a lot of different places, and I have to say I ask myself this question every day as well, to look at other places that it might plug in and might be of benefit. So some of the things we've already been talking about, bystander education, this is a popular method on campuses right now, and there is evidence coming in, right, that's showing efficacy, at least in terms of students reporting that they would be more likely to use some of these techniques, and even some research that I've read that said that students using similar kinds of theater-based techniques were more likely to use these techniques than something that was presented, let's say, more in a lecture format. So I think that's one big part of it. The other thing that I did at Indiana University was we also practiced affirmative consent, which is another big piece of this. One other thing that I did at IUSB that I didn't mention yet was I presented a lecture that included actually excerpts from a one-person play that I wrote about my own healing journey, healing from sexual violation. And when I had the opportunity it's a different way of using theater completely, in terms of telling my own story and creating, in that instance, I feel like I'm normalizing discussions around these topics, which affects, I think, the prevention side, but it also helps survivors, I believe, and it's been my experience talking to survivors in conjunction with my performances, helps them to come forward and talk about their own sexual violation. On campus, it's really important that students who perhaps come to campus having already been violated, that they seek help, they seek some sort of support structure, and they realize that this is something that needs support when they're in this new environment and exploring their lives in this kind of way, especially with the prevalence, of course, of violation on campus. So that's another way that theater can be used. I think that the dialogue theater can be used in a variety of different ways. It doesn't have to just be around bystander education or consent education. It can also be it could be a way of engaging men, which is another part of a piece of a comprehensive program. I see that gender equity really came up in the training that I did, because there were a lot of students. There were trans students there. There were students who were of different genders. We talked a lot about how a heteronormative model can really alienate LGBTQ students, and how they felt that really we need to have this as part of the conversation, and studies do show that a lot of these students are targeted, in fact, for violation, but can be left out of some of the conversations. One thing that I'm really interested in as well are partnerships on campus, which I know is another big piece of this.
Yeah.
And I think the peer education is definitely something that I initiated. My goals doing this, though, are to partner with different fraternities, partner with athletic departments, partner with all kinds of different entities on campus so that I can then help them to have these conversations. And I do have a kind of fantasy where, where I could train, in fact, leadership, not just designated peer leadership on campus who's already doing sexual assault prevention, but train peer leaders perhaps at fraternities, and they then can train they can hold trainings for their fraternity brothers so that there can be this this passing on of these somewhat fun but yet very, very effective participant, student-centered techniques so that the leadership then doesn't just fall on, let's say, the same set of people. Mm-hmm. And one other way that I've used theater in the past and have used it on campuses, though not yet in this context, is to have a forum for storytelling like I did at the DC Rape Crisis Center, where survivors could tell their stories and perform their stories. And I'd also really love to do, and I'm working on arranging this, to do something like the vagina monologues, except it would not be just women's stories. It would be everybody's stories, and it wouldn't necessarily be focused exclusively on, it would be focused on, I think, healthy sexuality. So it wouldn't just be focused on violation itself, but just to have a forum for people to talk about their experiences. Students are being inundated with so much information around this, and there's so much stuff going on campus, so much activism, but also so many crimes on campus along these lines. I really do think theater has a place to help students to process this, not just to add one more thing that they're that they're learning about, but maybe give them an opportunity to tell their story. What is their experience of receiving this information? I would really love that opportunity because I think it's really important to get that feedback on one hand, and also to give them the opportunity to make this their own in that way.
Well, I love that idea, and I think that, when we talk about preventing sexual violence, a piece of that puzzle is really about promoting healthy sexuality and
Right.
sexual health promotion and including everyone's voices. So I think that if theater can accomplish that, sign me up. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Laura. Is there anything else, anywhere that you see prevention going in the future and ways that theater can be a part of that, specifically on campuses or even off campuses?
Well, because I've done this a lot of work K through 12, I'm really thinking right now about how I can adapt the work that I'm doing on campus, adapt it to working with younger populations. I mentioned that I have done some anti-bullying programs. Mm-hmm. And so I really do think that there's a great potential there. And in fact, I know in the field there is a lot of attention right now looking at some of these campus programs, adapting them to middle schools and even younger. And but also looking at maybe some of the anti-bullying programs and some research around those and seeing if they may be adapted. So that's definitely a direction that I'm interested in going in the future. And I think in addition to that, it's really maybe seeing where the need is. I know I talked to one campus, it was a Catholic university, and not Catholic U, but a Catholic college. And they have an abstinence pledge. There's an official term, but it's basically an abstinence pledge. So they you can't openly talk about consent because you can't openly acknowledge that the students are having relations, right, which creates an obstacle for this kind of work. But I talked to some professors there about developing a program in the future, and that program was more along the lines of students being able to tell their own stories, but we talked about maybe stories that might be appealing to the students, but also that would work within those confines. Mm-hmm. And I think that theater, again, has the potential to maybe go into maybe these nooks and crannies where traditional programs can't go for a variety of reasons, and maybe to not to get around things in a sneaky way, but to basically give students an opportunity, even in those situations, to have their voice, because I think that we need to hear from them. We need to know what's happened to them, what they're afraid of, what they're making of all of this, and how we need to empower them, basically. We need to give them opportunities. And I do think that that theater is part of this. So I'm thrilled to be part of that and to keep thinking every day. What else?
Yeah, it seems like, there's just so many possibilities. So thank you so much. The work that you're doing is really exciting, and I'm so glad that you took a few minutes to share it with us. So thank you again, Laura.
Thank you, Ashley. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.